The morning sun barely peeked through the tall windows of courtroom 304 in the Philadelphia County Courthouse. It was 9:30 a.m. On a chilly Tuesday morning, Judge Marcus Sterling adjusted his black robe to get ready for another day of cases. At 62 years old, with gray hair and tired eyes, he had been on the bench for 25 years and felt as though he had seen it all. The courthouse bustled with its normal morning affairs. Low clerks scurrying through the marble hallways with stacks of papers. Lawyers in expensive suits whispering to their clients. The wooden benches in the courtroom were filled with persons waiting to have their case called. Sarah Chin is Judge Sterling's clerk for the last 3 years. She organized the day's files on his desk. As she reached a certain case, she hesitated and frowned slightly as she noticed something. But before she could mention it, Judge Sterling waved her off. "Let's get started," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he had cultivated over decades. The first several cases moved quickly, routine morning matters of traffic infractions and misdemeanor stuff. Judge Sterling disposed of them with automatic ease, never looking up from the papers on his desk. He had a reputation in the Philadelphia legal community as being inflexible, even cruel, with certain types of defendants, but nobody ever spoke of it out loud. Until 10:45 a.m. The next called was Docket Number 2024, County Route 789, Commonwealth vs. Dr. Maya Washington. A woman stood from the back of the courtroom. Dr. Maya Washington walked forward with quiet dignity, her steps measured and calm. She wore a navy blue business suit. Her natural hair was neatly styled and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had been used to high-pressure situations. At 42 years old, she had this sort of presence that usually was supposed to command respect in whatever room she came into. But Judge Sterling barely looked up. He shuffled through the papers, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. The charge was a traffic-related infraction that had evolved into a lot of misfortune. A missed court date due to an emergency surgery she had to perform, coupled with a misunderstanding with a police officer. Thomas Reed began, "Your Honor, Dr. Washington is a respected neurosurgeon at Philadelphia General Hospital. The McCourt date was due to an emergency operation that couldn't wait. We have documentation." Judge Sterling cut him off with a wave of his hand. "The facts are quite straightforward, Counselor. Your client avoided a court appearance and then resisted a servicing of the bench warrant by an officer of the law when he finally tried to serve it." Dr. Washington stood tall, hands clasped at her waist. She had spent the last 18 hours performing back-to-back brain surgeries, saving both patients' lives, before coming directly to court. Dark circles under her eyes told the tale of her exhaustion, but her voice was steady. "Your Honor, if I may explain," she began, but Judge Sterling's sharp glance cut her off. "The time for explanations was at your original court date, Ms. Washington." He said it with inflection on the Ms., and without using her professional title. The corner of his mouth quivered down as he looked again to the file in front of him. Several lawyers who had finished their own cases remained behind in the gallery to witness. They exchanged knowing looks. Anyone who spent time in Judge Sterling's courtroom knew his patterns. Sarah Chin squirmed in her chair, a flutter of fingers over her keyboard. She had observed something in Dr. Washington's file, something important, but with the judge's dismissive attitude, she found herself hesitating to pipe up now. The air in the courtroom grew dense as Judge Sterling launched into his lecture. "This court's time is valuable, Miss Washington. Your disregard for the law and subsequent behavior toward law enforcement shows a pattern of disrespect for our legal system." Dr. Washington remained stoic, but her attorney was looking more and more alarmed. A disputed right turn on a yellow light had somehow snowballed into so much more. Sarah finally found the courage to stop fidgeting and start writing a note. She knew what was coming next. She had seen this scene played out too many times before. Yet something felt different this time. This time she knew something the judge didn't. As Judge Sterling began to pronounce his sentence, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds outside. Long shadows stretched across the courtroom floor. And no one in that room, least of all Judge Sterling, was in himself cognizant that the next few moments were about to change everything. Judge Sterling cleared his throat and leaned forward in the high-back chair. Fluorescent lights overhead of courtroom 304 droned on, casting stark shadows across his stern face. Dr. Maya Washington stood perfectly still, her exhaustion from 18 hours of surgery masked by professional dignity. "Miss Washington," Judge Sterling began, again deliberately disregarding her title, "this court cannot operate when individuals decide to flout its authority." His voice echoed throughout the now quiet courtroom, where even the ubiquitous rustling of papers had seized. Sarah Chen's hand quivered slightly as she wrote her note. She knew she had to act fast, but years of courtroom etiquette made her hesitate. Interrupting a judge during sentencing was all but unprecedented. "Your original violation was minor," Judge Sterling continued, his tone growing harder with each word, "but your subsequent actions show a disturbing disregard for law enforcement and this court." He paused, looking down at Dr. Washington over his reading glasses. The gallery had grown unusually full. The word had spread through the courthouse about what is happening in courtroom 304, and several lawyers and court staff found reasons to linger. They'd seen this pattern before, what started as a simple traffic ticket turning into something much more serious. Thomas Reed, Dr. Washington's attorney, stood up quickly. "Your Honor, if we could submit evidence of the emergency surgery that caused..." Counselor Judge Sterling cut him off sharply. "You've had your chance to speak. The time for explanations has passed." His fingers drummed against his desk, a habit he displayed when his patients wore thin. Dr. Washington's shoulders remained straight, but her fingers tightened around each other. In her mind, she saw the faces of the two patients she'd saved last night, a teenage boy with a brain tumor and an elderly woman with a hemorrhage. Both would have died if she hadn't missed that court date. "This court sentences you to 30 days in county jail," Judge Sterling announced, the gallery erupting with a collective gasp, "plus a fine of $5,000. "Your Honor." Sarah Chen's voice cut through the courtroom like a thunderbolt. She had never, not once in 15 years, interrupted a judge. Her hand shaking, she scurried forward with her note, almost tripping over her sensible shoes. Judge Sterling turned to her, his face flushing red at the interruption. "Miss Chen, what is the meaning of?" But Sarah had already laid the note in front of him. Her usual neat handwriting was hurried and urgent. "Dr. Maya Washington, chief of neurosurgery at Philadelphia General, saved Emma's life last October. Your granddaughter's emergency surgery." The color drained out of Judge Sterling's face as he read the note. His hands, so steady, began to shake a little. He looked up at Dr. Washington, really seeing her for the first time that morning. Memories flooded back. His 16-year-old granddaughter Emma, the terrifying phone call about her collapse at soccer practice, the desperate hours in the hospital waiting room. You remembered a surgeon who had walked out at 3 a.m. still in her scrubs to inform them Emma would make a full recovery. The same surgeon who now stood before him in his courtroom. "Dr. Washington," he said softly, her proper title finally finding its way to his lips. The change in his tone made everyone in the courtroom lean forward slightly. Dr. Washington met his gaze steadily. "Yes, Your Honor, I remember Emma well. She had an arteriovenous malformation, a type of brain bleed. She's doing very well in her follow-up appointments." The silence in the courtroom grew thick. The hands of Judge Sterling went to pull off his reading glasses to reveal eyes that suddenly appeared older, more distressed, as the familiar walls of his prejudices cracked, letting an uncomfortable rays of truth. Sarah Chen stepped back toward the desk. Her heart was pounding. In the gallery, the lawyers watching exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew they were beholding one of those moments when justice, true justice, hung in the air. Judge Sterling looked down at his sentencing notes, then back at Dr. Washington. His next words would acknowledge either his mistake or his prejudice. The weight of the moment weighed upon all of them in courtroom 304, as heavy as the morning air before a storm. For 30 very long seconds, Judge Sterling sat completely still in his chair, his face contorted in a mixture of shock and realization. Except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the faraway, echoing lunge of footsteps down the hall outside, courtroom 304 was silent. He remembered that terrible night at Philadelphia General Hospital, as though it had been yesterday. Dear Emma, his granddaughter, lying white and unconscious upon the hospital bed. And the doctors, explaining, were saying something about an emergency surgery of the brain. The endless waiting, praying, and hoping. And then Dr. Washington coming out from the operation room at 3 a.m. still wearing her surgical scrubs, telling them Emma was going to live. Your Honor. Thomas Reed's voice softly intruded into the judge's reflections. Perhaps we could take a brief recess. The clearing of Judge Sterling's throat, his hands tightening on the edge of the desk, preceded his words. Yes, a 15-minute recess. His voice now was strange, softer, less certain. Dr. Washington, please remain in the courtroom. The gallery was emptying, the whispers filling the air. The court officers stood uncomfortable by the doors, sensing that something out of the ordinary hung in the air. Saracen buzzed herself, arranging papers, though her eyes kept darting. Between the judge and Dr. Washington once, the courtroom was mostly empty. Judge Sterling stood up. He no longer looked like the stern, unyielding figure from just minutes ago. Instead, he seemed older, more human, more vulnerable. Dr. Washington, he began stepping down from the bench. I owe you an apology, not just for today, but he paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. To him, would you join me in my chambers? Your attorney is welcome to accompany us in the judge's chambers. The morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, creating stripes of sunshine across the dark wooden desk. There were family photos that lined the shelves, including one of Emma at her recent soccer championship shift, alive and smiling because of the woman standing before him. Dr. Washington sat down, her posture still professional but slightly more relaxed. The exhaustion from her long night of surgeries was more visible now in the natural light. Emma showed me her trophy last month during her final checkup, she said quietly, nodding toward the soccer photo. She's made a remarkable recovery, Judge. Sterling reached out for the photo, her fingers still trembling. I wouldn't be alive without you. He laid the frame down and locked eyes with Dr. Washington. And this morning, without taking the time to even look at you, I was ready to send you to jail. Thomas Reed sat quietly, mesmerized by what was unfolding before him. He had been practicing law for the last 20 years, and had never quite seen anything like this. Your Honor, Dr. Washington ventured carefully, what happened this morning is not about me alone. It's about every person who comes into your courtroom. The judge slumped back into his chair, the weight of her words hitting him hard. How many others had he judged unfairly? How many times had he let his prejudices blind him to the human being standing before him last night? Dr. Washington continued, I performed 2 emergency surgeries. One was on a 17-year-old boy named Marcus. The other was on a grandmother named Ruth. Both are alive this morning. That's why I missed my original court date 3 months ago. I was saving another life. Judge Sterling looked at the medical documentation on his desk that he had earlier refused to flip to the next page. A narrative of lives spared, families remaining intact, because Dr. Washington put her patients first. Saracen knocked lightly and came in with a pile of files. Your Honor, I took the liberty of pulling some of your recent cases. There's a pattern here you might want to see. The judge nodded, starting to grasp the whole dimension of this moment. His decision hadn't changed only Dr. Washington's life. It had touched a lot of lives over the years on the bench. Now, finally, The morning sun was up and filling the chamber with light clarity. Unforgiving light at that brightness, Judge Sterling could no longer hide from himself and his actions. The question was, what would he do with this revelation? Dr. Washington watched him closely, seeing the internal struggle play across his face. This could be a real turning point or another missed opportunity for change. The next few minutes would tell which path Judge Sterling would choose. That night, Judge Marcus Sterling couldn't sleep. He sat in his home office, surrounded by law books and case files, with only a desk lamp turned on. The wall clock was pointed at 11:45 p.m., but his mind kept whizzing back to the morning's events. In courtroom 304, on his desk lay two photographs. The first showed his granddaughter Emma scoring a goal in her recent soccer match, something that would never have happened if Dr. Washington hadn't saved her life. The second was a copy of Dr. Washington's medical credentials that Sarah Chin had printed for him. Decades of education, countless lives saved, and numerous awards for her work in poor communities. Marcus, are you coming to bed? His wife Linda appeared in the doorway wearing her blue robe. She knew that look on her husband's face when his world had been shaken. I almost sent her to jail, Linda, he said quietly, still staring at the photos. The same doctor who saved Emma's life. I didn't even look at her properly. I just saw. His voice trailed off, unable to finish the painful truth. Linda walked into the office and sat across from him. Tell me what happened, she said gently. So he did, starting with the morning's court session and ending with his shameful realization. Meanwhile, across town in Philadelphia General Hospital, Dr. Maya Washington was finishing another late shift. She stood at the nurse's station updating patient charts, her mind occasionally drifting to that morning's events in court. Dr. Washington, a young resident, approached her. The family of Marcus Thompson, your surgery patient from last night, they wanted you to have this, he said, handing her a hand-drawn card covered in colorful crayon drawings. She opened it, finding a picture of herself had been drawn inside. Beneath it, in letters that shook just a little, was scrawled, "Thank you for saving my Bach brother." The innocent words brought tears welling into her eyes, reminding her why she had chosen this road despite all the obstructions. Back to his office, Judge Sterling started to pull out files of some of his past cases. The words of Sarah Chin haunted him about patterns. He started to make notes, making 2 columns on a legal pad. Evidence mounted, and it was making him sick to his stomach. His phone buzzed. A text from Emma. Grandpa, Mom told me what happened today. Drive W is amazing, isn't she? She checks on me every time I have a follow-up. She even came to my soccer game last month. The judge's hand shook as he read the message. He remembered Dr. Washington's words from that morning. What happened today is about more than me. Finally, in her hospital office, after her shift, sat down. A news alert popped up on her computer. Another story of scant justice dispensed. She thought about the face of Judge Sterling when he finally placed her. That moment when the carefully built walls began to crack. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph, her graduation day from medical school. She was the only black woman in her class. Her mother had told her that day, baby, you're not just becoming a doctor, you're becoming a mirror that shows people their own prejudices. At midnight, Judge Sterling was still awake. He walked to his kitchen for water and found Linda waiting with 2 cups of tea. Remember what my father used to say? Linda asked, sliding a cup toward him. The hardest person to judge fairly is yourself. The judge nodded, warming his hands around the cup. I've spent 25 years on the bench, Linda. How many lives have I affected? How many Dr. Washingtons have stood before me? And I never saw them for who they really were. In the quiet of that late hour, both Judge Sterling and Dr. Washington, in their separate places, were thinking about change. The judge opened his laptop and began typing a letter to the State Judicial Review Board. Dr. Washington finished her patient notes and added one more thing to her schedule, a lecture on bias in healthcare and justice systems that she had been invited to give. The night grew deeper, but for both of them, something new was beginning. Sometimes, it takes a mirror to show us who we really are, And then again, sometimes that mirror comes with a face of a person we almost wronged. Within a few hours, the sun would rise on a new day, and both the judge and the doctor would face their own reflections again. But by now, both had a little better understanding of the weight their actions pulled and the power they had to effect change. A week from the incident in the courtroom, Judge Sterling sat in his office surrounded by towers of case files. His death calendar showed 7:30 a.m., but he had been there since dawn. Sarah Chin stood nearby, adding another stack of folders to the already crowded space. "That's the last 5 years of cases, Your Honor," Sarah said, pointing to the colored tabs she had organized: red for harsh sentences, yellow for moderate, green for lenient ones. The pattern could not be missed. The red tab seemed to appear much more on the files of minority defendants. Judge Sterling picked up one of the red tag files. James Carter, African American, 19 years old, first offense shoplifting. I gave him 6 months. His voice grew heavy. Next case. That same day. Michael Brooks White, 20 years old, same charge, same circumstances, 3 months probation. Teasingly, Sarah watched her boss, who was once so sure of judgments, question every decision. The proud man who never admitted he ever made mistakes was gone, replaced by someone determined to face uncomfortable truths. Across town, Dr. Washington was giving her morning rounds at Philadelphia General Hospital when her phone buzzed. There was an email from the State Judicial Review Board requesting her presence at a hearing. Judge Sterling had reported himself for bias and sentencing and listed her case as evidence. "Everything okay?" he dried W. asked Jenny, her favorite nurse, noticing her surprised expression. "Yes," Dr. Washington replied, still staring at her phone. "Just unexpected news. Sometimes people can surprise you in good ways." Back at his chambers, Judge Sterling met with Judge Maria Rodriguez, a respected colleague known for her fair sentencing. She sat across from him, reviewing his revelations. "Marcus," she said, looking up from the papers, "what you're doing, it's brave, but it's also going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Some of your colleagues aren't going to thank you for shining this light on the system." Sterling nodded, recalling how he used to reject any concerns about bias in the courts. "Maria, I've been wrong for so long. Last week, I almost sent a brilliant surgeon to jail because I couldn't see beyond my own prejudice. How many others have I read throughout the day?" He met other judges, legal scholars, and civil rights lawyers. Each meeting was more difficult than the last, but he didn't avoid the tough conversations. Meanwhile, Dr. Washington received yet another surprise call. The local bar association wanted her to speak at their annual conference about her experience. She sat in her office thinking about the request. "I'm a surgeon, not a public speaker," she told her colleague Dr. James Chen over lunch. "Maybe that's precisely why you should do it," Dr. Chen said. "You can help them put a face to the defendant's table." Back in the courthouse, Sarah Chin brought Judge Sterling his afternoon coffee and found him reviewing video recordings of his past court sessions. The recording showed a pattern he had never noticed before: his different tones of voice, his body language, rushed judgments. "Your Honor," Sarah said carefully, "Channel 7 News has been calling. They've heard about yourself, and want to do a story." Sterling shook his head. "This isn't about publicity, Sarah. It's about fixing what I broke." He picked up another file. "Look at this one. Sandra Thompson. Denny bail for a minor offense. Single mother. Lost her job because of my decision." As the afternoon wore on, more and more files exposed more patterns. In each case, Judge Sterling had jotted a note where his prejudice might have obscured his judgment. The list lengthened, yet he didn't stop. Each name meant a person whose life he had touched one way or another. In the evening, his office looked like a war room. Files were everywhere. Colored sticky notes covered his walls. Sarah had stayed late to help. For the first time, she felt like a part of something big. "We need to review at least 10 years of cases," he said, rubbing his tired eyes. And then Sarah asked, "And then we start making things right?" He said, dialing again and calling the review board. Outside his window, the sun was setting over Philadelphia's skyline, painting it with hues of orange and purple. Back in her office at the hospital, Dr. Washington was finishing up the last of her work for the day and sending off her RSVP to the Bar Association's invitation. Change happened one conversation at a time, she knew. The largest meeting room in the Philadelphia County Courthouse was full. Judge Sterling standing at the podium in front of more than 200 people, former defendants, lawyers, community leaders, and fellow judges. He felt the morning sun streaming through the tall windows, illuminating nervous sweat on his forehead. "My name is Marcus Sterling," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "For 25 years I've served as a judge in this courthouse. And for 25 years I've been part of the problem." He paused, gazing out at the faces in front of him. Today, that changes. In the front row, Dr. Maya Washington sat next to Sarah Chin. They watched as the judge who once ruled his courtroom, once stiff with authority, was now bent in humility towards the community he had harmed. "We've examined more than 3,000 of my P cases," Sterling resumed, nodding towards the screen behind him displaying statistics. "It's obvious. I have no excuse. The proof of my racism is obvious and undeniable. African American defendants serving an average of 40% more time than white defendants for the same crimes, Latino defendants being asked for higher bail amounts, and Asian Americans being denied interpreters more often." A murmur swept through the crowd. Some people nodded in recognition of their experiences. Others looked appalled at the numbers. Sterling said, "But the numbers don't tell it." His voice gathered strength. "Behind every case, there was a person, an individual whose life I touched. James Carter, a man who lost his scholarship because of my unduly harsh sentence. Maria Gonzalez, her children were taken into foster care because I denied her bail. David Chin's restaurant closed when I refused even to consider his family circumstances." Some in the audience wiped away tears. Others sat straight-backed, their faces masks of stored pain. "I cannot turn back the clock," Sterling added, "but I can work to make it right." He gestured to a team of lawyers sitting at a side table. "Starting today, we're launching the Sterling Review Initiative. Every case where my bias had an impact on the outcome will be reviewed. We have partnered with the Public Defender Office and private law firms who will work pro bono to help overturn unjust sentences." Dr. Washington watched as some audience members hue each other. She remembered her own morning in his courtroom, how close she had come to joining the list of lives disrupted by prejudice. The judge continued, "We've also set up a reparations fund. I'm selling my vacation home, and I'm putting in my own savings. It won't make everything right, but it's a start." Sarah Chin got up now and walked to the podium with more files. These had green stickers, cases already identified to be taken under review right away. The work had long since begun. "But the most important change," Sterling said, addressing his fellow judges, "has to be the way that we go forward. I am working with the Judicial Review Board to create new rules for bias checks and sentencing. Every judge would have to go over his own patterns twice a year." Some of his colleagues squirmed in their seats. Change wasn't easy, especially for those accustomed to being beyond question. Following the presentation, a line formed to speak with Judge Sterling. Each had a story, a case, a memory. He listened to all, jotting down names, case numbers, details. No more rushing through lives as if those people were merely numbers on a docket. Dr. Washington approached him last. "That couldn't have been easy. That couldn't have been easy," she said. Extending her hand, Sterling shook it, remembering how differently he had treated her just weeks ago. "The easy path led me wrong for 25 years, Doctor. It's time for the harder road." Later that afternoon, news crews gathered outside the courthouse. The story was spreading, a judge admitting bias, working to make amends, challenging the system itself. Some called it career suicide, others called it a watershed moment in his chambers. Judge Sterling met with the first group of lawyers who would review his old cases. The work ahead was enormous, but for the first time in his career, he felt like he was truly serving justice. Dr. Washington returned to her hospital, where she found a message waiting. Other courts in other cities wanted to know more about the Sterling Initiative. Change, like a pebble thrown in water, was creating ripples. That evening, as the courthouse emptied, Sarah Chin found Judge Sterling still at his desk reviewing more files. On his wall hung a new sign written in clear letters: "Justice is not just what we do, but how we do it." The real work was just beginning. 3 months after Judge Sterling's public admission, the Philadelphia Judicial Center's main auditorium was filled to capacity. Dr. Maya Washington stood at the podium facing an audience of judges, lawyers, and medical professionals from across the country. Medicine and justice has something important in common, she began, her voice clear and confident. In both fields, our biases can mean the difference between life and death, freedom or imprisonment. In the front row, Judge Sterling sat with Sarah Chin, both taking the conference entitled "Breaking Bias. Healthcare and Justice" was the first of its kind in bringing professionals from both worlds to address systemic PR. 6 months ago, I was almost sent to jail for a traffic violation. As Dr. Washington continued, showing a slide of her operating room, performing emergency surgery on the same day that she saved 2 lives. In that courtroom, none of that mattered. I wasn't Dr. Washington, the neurosurgeon. I was just another face that fit into somebody's prejudiced expectations. The audience shifted uncomfortably at the end. Many recognized their biases in her words. At the back of the room, Emma, Judge Sterling's granddaughter, sat with her parents, now fully recovered from her brain surgery, watched the doctor who had saved her life teach another kind of healing the system itself. But this is not a story about one judge or a single doctor, Dr. Washington said. It is a story about the choices we make daily in the ER. And I can't choose which patients to care for based on his or her appearance. In the courtroom, justice must be equally blind. Click to the next slide, showing the results of Sterling Initiative's first 3 months. 157 cases reviewed, 89 sentences reduced or overturned, $1.2 million in compensation distributed, and 23 other judges voluntarily joined the review process. Next, Judge Sterling rose and took a position beside Dr. Washington at the podium. Gone was the man who once commanded his courtroom with an iron fist of authority. Instead, he spoke humbly. "We found something powerful," he said. "When we show that we can admit when we're wrong and work to make it right, people start trusting the system." Over the past 3 months, court appearances have increased. People believe that they may actually receive a fair hearing. Sarah Chin presented the next section of how they had modified the day-to-day functioning of the court. Every judge had a bias check system in place now. Case reviews were monthly instead of yearly. Public defenders received more resources. Lunch break DR. Washington walked down the corridors of the hospital along with Judge Sterling as they stopped outside the pediatric ward where some of her small patients were recovering. "Remember what you told me that day in your chamber?" she asked, about not being able to undo the past. Sterling nodded, watching a child in a wheelchair practice walking with a physical therapist. "In medicine," she continued, "we can't undo damage either, but we can help heal. We can help people move forward. That's what you're doing with the initiative." Back at the conference afternoon session focused on practical changes, other courts shared their plans to adopt similar programs. Medical schools discussed new training to address bias in healthcare. Law schools presented updated curricula. Emma joined them for the last panel, sharing her experience from both sides as a patient protected by Dr. Washington, and as the granddaughter of a judge that had learned to change. "My grandfather taught me that being strong was admitting when you were wrong," she had informed the audience. "Dr. Washington showed me every person deserves to be seen for whom they actually are." The day closing, Dr. Washington learned 5 more cities were asking for information about starting their very own bias review programs. Judge Sterling discovered more judges volunteering as Dr. Washington hastened to leave and judge. Sterling, too, was taking his leave. Dr. Washington hurried to catch up. "We're making progress," she said, "but there's still so much work to do." "Yes," he agreed, "but now we're doing it together, doctors, judges, lawyers, communities, all of us learning to see each other clearly." They looked up at the hospital building where lights glowed in patient rooms, then at the courthouse next door where late-working lawyers still moved through lit offices, two places of power, of life-changing decisions, slowly learning to serve everyone equally. The next day would bring more cases, more surgeries, more chances to either perpetuate bias or fight it. But now there was a way forward, and they weren't walking it alone. A year had come and gone since that morning in courtroom 304. Over 1,000 were in attendance at the National Judicial Conference in Washington, D.C. Backstage, Judge Marcus Sterling and Dr. Maya Washington stood side by side, awaiting their keynote speech. "Nervous?" Dr. Washington asked, noticing Judge Sterling adjusting his third-time tie. "A little," he admitted. "A year ago, I was just a judge who thought he knew everything. Now I'm speaking to judges from all 50 states about everything I got wrong." Through the curtain, they could see Emma sitting in the front row. Now 17, she had become an active speaker in high schools about bias and justice. Next to her sat Sarah Chin, who had just been promoted to the new position of Chief Court Administrator, responsible for coordinating bias prevention programs. The conference host approached the podium. Today's speakers need no introduction. Their story has mobilized change in courts coast to coast. Please welcome Judge Marcus Sterling and Dr. Maya Washington. As they took the stage, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Behind them, on screens, numbers told their story. 1,247 cases reviewed and corrected, 37 states adopting similar programs, for $5 million in compensation distributed, 89% reduction in sentencing disparities in participating courts. 1 year ago, Drive Washington began. "I stood in a courtroom facing jail time. Today I stand before you as a partner in change." She looked at Judge Sterling. "But this isn't just about two people, it's about all the lives touched by bias, and all the lives now being touched by reform." Judge Sterling stepped forward. "The hardest moment in any judge's life," he said, "is admitting we've been wrong, but the most important moment is deciding to make it right." They showed videos from around the country. A young man graduating college after his wrongful conviction was overturned. A grandmother opening a new business with her compensation funds. Judges and doctors collaborating to combat bias in both professions. Into the middle of their remarks, breaking news flashed on everyone's phones. The Supreme Court had just announced new national guidelines for bias review in all federal courts based on the Sterling Initiative. Sarah Chin rushed backstage and handed them the news release. DR and then rinsed. Washington read it aloud to the audience, her voice shaking with passion. "It is a justice system that reflects the reality that every human life matters, and therefore has a right to be seen, to be heard, and to be judged in just manner." The workshop sessions followed the keynote, judges sharing the realities of implementing reform, public defenders talking about increased resourcing, medical professionals sharing similar stories from healthcare. During lunch, Emma joined them at their table. "Grandpa," she said, pulling out her phone, "my story about you and Dr. Washington won some national high school essay contest. They want to publish it within the law journals." Judge Sterling hugged his granddaughter, remembering just how close he had come to losing her, and just how his prejudice had almost made him hurt the very person who later saved her. Later in the afternoon, there was a session led by Dr. Washington pertaining to bias in the emergency room for surgery. "We cannot choose our patients," she said. "It's like injustice, you can't choose who deserves fairness. Everyone deserves equal treatment, equal justice, respect." At the close of the conference, the surprise came for Judge Sterling. The National Judicial College would establish a new annual award, the Sterling/Washington Prize for Judicial Reform, to recognize judges whose work sought to eliminate bias in their courts. "This isn't an award about me," he said at the ceremony. "It's about all the souls who stood in my courtroom and didn't receive the justice they were due. It is for any judge who stares into the mirror and changes. It is for any Dr. Washington who challenges us, in spite of the obstacles we have thrown in their path." That evening, as they left the conference center, they saw a group of young law students waiting to talk to them, the next generation of judges and lawyers eager to learn from their story. "Do you ever regret that morning in court?" one student asked Dr. Washington. She looked at Judge Sterling, then at Emma, then back at the student. "That morning showed us that change is possible when we see each other clearly, when we had made our mistakes, when we work to make things right. That's when justice becomes real." As they walked into the Washington evening, they passed the Supreme Court, its phrase chiseled in granite. Equal justice under law, but something else now, something more profound, truer, and human than ever before. Of course, the story was not over. But it was now everybody's to know, for those who would look in the mirror and choose to change.